So the First Amendment is different from anything we have in British law at the moment, and that's because it's part of the United States Constitution. And before we answer the question of whether or not we need a First Amendment in this country, we need to understand what the purpose of a constitution is to decide if we want to have a constitution in this country. And the proper function of a constitution is to define and limit the scope of government. Government is the organization that has a monopoly on the use of force in a given area. It's the organization that has the right to coerce you. And that very naturally has a lot of power. The proper function of a constitution is to limit that power, to define when it can and when it can't use that power. That's why we need constitutions, I think. What is the proper function of government? What is the function that the constitution should keep the government within? It's to create the conditions necessary for every individual, not just the majority, every single individual in a society to live fully as a human being, to use his or her own mind to choose values, choose goals, pursue those, achieve a flourishing life. And that requires removing force from society. It requires the government to protect you from anyone who wants to steal from you, rob you, defraud you, incite violence against you. Now, the government should not be a tool for the majority or for the political class or the aristocracy or anything like that to impose its particular views on individuals. It should just be protecting individual rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, which includes the right to freedom of speech. Those are the rights that you need to live fully as a human being. You need the ability, the freedom to choose your values and pursue them. And that includes the right to speak your mind on your property or on somebody else's property with their consent. It does not include the right to somebody else's property or to somebody else's platform. Without a right to free speech, you can't choose your values, you can't discuss ideas, you can't debate values, you can't consider what is or is not the right set of morality, set of values. You can't even discuss what's true and false. So the function of a constitution is to keep, and indeed of the First Amendment, is to keep the government accountable to that proper function. Without it, by its nature, the government is free to use force willy-nilly against anyone as it sees fit. So essentially, a group of people, whether it's the largest number of people in an election, whether it's a powerful minority, can hijack that force and use it to impose their code of morality. Now, a constitution is different from regular law, like British common law, because it sits outside the normal legal process. It sits above the normal legal process. That makes it much harder for a group, whether they're numerically stronger or economically stronger or politically stronger, to undo that protection. And that's why I think we need a First Amendment. We need something that sits outside the ability of the majority to violate the rights of the minority. And it's also, to the point that Nico made earlier, it's why it needs to be worded very precisely and very objectively. It needs to be based on the actual requirements of human life, not on somebody's particular idea of what free speech constitutes, but on the actual necessary steps to protect individuals from the use of force against them and otherwise leave them free to live their lives as they see fit. The only alternative to a system like I'm describing, a constitutional system, is a system where anyone, the strongest, the most numerous, can hijack the government for their own purposes. Powerful people enforcing their ideas. That's exactly what we see in the realm of speech today. We see an in-clique in terms of ideas about gender, ideas about religion. We see a dominant culture. It's not, I don't think, numerically dominant necessarily, but a powerful culture imposing its edicts about the idea that you can't criticize religion, particularly Islam, about the idea that you can't say there are only two genders, all that kind of stuff. Discussion of principles, discussion of facts is being controlled and restricted, and a particular view is being put across by force. It's one thing if people put that view across privately, it's another thing if they use government force to do that. That prevents people from using their own minds to discover the truth about the world. One more thing I want to make very clear is that the requirements of human life are objective facts. They are facts you can understand by looking at human beings. It is a fact that we are individuals, that we live by the use of our own mind, that we create values and choose goals individually. These are objective things. You can see the evidence for them everywhere in human nature, in how we behave. Contrary to that, and by the way, I think the United States Constitution is not perfect, but it is largely based on those objective facts about human beings. British law is not. British law is very arbitrary. The common law system we have in this country basically means that whoever's in at the moment can just override previous legislation. We have a mismatch of 50 different people's ideas, or 50 different governments' ideas of what the proper way to do things is. we don't have a standard of objectivity. We don't have a constitution there to look back to and say, these are the facts, the principles we're going to govern our country by. Last thing I'll say is that some speech is disgusting, like Tom said. Some horrific stuff was being done. I mean, some genuine violence and force was being used, but in July. But speech itself is not a use of force. It's only a use of force if it represents a credible threat of violence. That's the only time the government should get involved. Otherwise, no matter how horrific, how appalling, we should privately chastise and sort of take our business away from people we disapprove of. We should not use government force to limit them. It is outside the proper role of government. And I think the need for a First Amendment is to keep the government within that proper role.
Thank you very much, Tom.